Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's JCOIN speaker series on medications for opioid use disorder in criminal justice settings. My name is Jessica Halsey with the Addiction Policy Forum. We are a contractor under the Coordination and Translation Center for JCOIN. And so excited to have so many people and partner organizations join us this afternoon. The JCOIN speaker series aims to highlight the latest in research and practice on key topics of interest in both the justice and health fields. And today our speakers include Dr. Tisha Wiley, Services Branch Chief at NIDA, Dr. Faye Taxman, a professor at George Mason University and PI, Principal Investigator of the CTC for JCOIN, along with Dr. Peter Friedmann, Chief Research Officer at Baystate Health and the Principal Investigator for JCOIN's Massachusetts Research Hub. So first, can I kick it to you, Dr. Wiley, just to give us a welcome and opening remarks and hear from NIDA?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for joining. I'm really excited to have the privilege to help lead JCOIN. In 2018, NIDA was given an opportunity to launch a bold and big initiative that was focused on addressing opioid use disorder in justice settings. But that really played to one of our strengths, because since NIDA was established as a scientific agency, we've really been focused on the justice system as a critical target for improving access to effective, high-quality substance use treatment. And we've been excited to be part of the process of building bridges across both justice and community service systems, so people can have continuity of care even when they transition between communities and jails and prisons or onto probation or parole. And I think if the last year of the COVID pandemic has taught us nothing else, it has underscored how important these cross-system partnerships really are. So the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network is a really exciting platform that we're using to move forward a vision. And that vision is that everyone who is involved in the justice system should have access to high quality, effective treatment. And that of course means access to medications for opioid use disorders, which are one of the most effective tools in our toolbox for opioid addiction. JCOIN is really robust, and across the network, we're testing new interventions to support effective linkages across those community and justice settings. We're comparing established interventions like long-acting buprenorphine and long-acting naltrexone. We are looking at how to best support organizations as they try to adopt best practices. And we're really building infrastructure and a pipeline of investigators and practitioners who have all the tools that they need to effectively partner and build that evidence base. But JCOIN is really possible because it builds on many years of research that has established which treatments are effective and has shown that these treatments can be delivered effectively in justice settings. So I'm really excited to be here today with two of the researchers that have really built that foundation and who are helping JCOIN move the needle on translating these findings into practice more effectively. So I'm really excited to listen with you as they share that evidence that we've accumulated and what it tells us about the best tools that we have to address opioid addiction. And I just want to end by saying that even though I come from a research funder, I know, as do all the leadership at NIDA, we all know that all the research in the world isn't effective or isn't helpful if it's not useful to our partners out in the field. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be part of JCOIN and these efforts to try to turn that into a reality. So I thank you all for joining and listening in today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Faye.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be present here today and, to talk about JCOIN. I'm really excited about the work we do in JCOIN, and I can say that from a very long career of doing work with justice and health organizations, where the emphasis was really around looking at particularly the effectiveness of studies, but not necessarily the efficacy of how we demonstrate our effectiveness, how we work with partners to be able to actually implement in practice and improve practice, and how we build new methodologies for the complex world of justice and health settings where it's not always easy to do research. So, I, as Jessica indicated, as the lead of the Coordination and Translation Center, we've really focused our efforts around a community partnership model with academic organizations. And so, NIDA, which Dr. Wiley has talked about, essentially gave the foundation for JCOIN, where each of the research centers within JCOIN was asked to bring to the table at least 5 partners. And we learned quickly that many of our colleagues in the research centers actually brought more than 5 as a way of testing out new ideas. But this whole notion of community engagement and academic partnerships is how we're approaching the efforts that the Coordination and Translation Center does. So one of our greatest principles is to engage the broadest array of partners and stakeholders that are really interested in the nexus between justice and health, and particularly interested in the vision for JCOIN that Dr. Wiley talked about, which was this notion is we want to be able to provide the most effective treatments to people who are potentially justice involved or who are likely to be involved in the justice system. And I use the term likely to be involved because, in today's world, we're really looking at ways of trying to provide services to prevent people from penetration into the justice system. So MOUD is one of those examples of an effective intervention, and Dr. Friedmann will discuss this in much more detail. But what we want to do in the CTC as part of our engagement strategy is to really work with, we have over 100 stakeholders that cuts across the cross-section of communities that are involved in providing care or policy that affects the provision of care. So we want to engage these partners, and we want to engage them in multiple ways, both in helping us develop knowledge about what's effective, what are some of the barriers and facilitators of care, develop knowledge about access to settings or systems and integration of those settings and systems, and then particularly around messaging about the effectiveness. As we know, getting from science to the practice is a 17-year ordeal, essentially, based upon medical science. In some areas, it can take 30 years or more. And we really want to expedite that transition from research to practice. And that requires us to really learn from the field. We want to also understand how to synthesize information and message that. And finally, as part of the CTC, we also are using in our research studies that are funded rigorous methods to be able to test what has an impact on uptake of evidence-based practices or effective treatments like MOUD. So one of the studies that Todd Mulfunter and myself from the University of Wisconsin are doing is looking at the NIDA process versus ECHO as a way of trying to basically detail which one has a greater impact on uptake of MOUD, both in a jail setting, but then in a community setting. So we have lots of things going on in the CTC. I hope you join the JCOIN's website. You can sign up below on the slide. It has the address for you to do that. We also have a number of learning and capacity building opportunities where you can become part of our network through either being engaged as a scholar or on a career path of learning how to do research in justice settings. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Friedmann to talk about studies on the effectiveness of MOUD.
Well, thank you, Dr. Taxman and Dr. Wiley. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go in and share my screen. So the host needs to enable screen sharing. I think that's Braden. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Slideshow. Can you see that? So I'll be talking about the FDA-approved medications for opioid use disorder. The term of art that is in fashion at the moment is medications for opioid use disorder. You may have others refer to it as medications for addiction treatment. I try not to use the term medication-assisted treatment because, as hopefully you'll see at the end of this talk, that the medication is not really assisting the treatment. The medication is the treatment, and it is the most effective treatment that we have for opiate use disorder. We often think of all of the addictive disorders in a very similar way, but they really are a family of disorders, and some of them we have very effective medications for, some of them not so much. And so we really want to sort of speak precisely about these instances and the types of treatments that are going to be most effective. So briefly, my outline, I have sort of 3 parts to this talk. I'm going to talk about addiction as a chronic neurobehavioral disorder, that MOUD works by attenuating positive and negative reinforcement, and then hopefully convince you that agonist treatment, and I'll explain to you what agonist treatment means, is the most effective way to reduce overdose. So this is a slide that I like to show at the beginning of a talk about addiction. Up in the upper right corner there, many of you who took Psychology 101 will recognize B.F. Skinner, who was the father of behaviorism, American behaviorism. And I really believe sort of in a behaviorism view of addictive disorders, that they really are disorders of learning, and the way that organisms learn associations between biologically relevant events, things that are important for survival and reproduction and other essential functions, is through stimuli in the environment. And when you experience a stimulus in the environment that's rewarding and associated with a behavior, that behavior tends to be repeated, and aversive stimuli tend to cause behaviors not to be repeated. And what we see in this figure is, a laboratory rat in what's affectionately called a Skinner box, and they have an IV put into their torso, and it's connected to what is an IV, an automated IV that could include morphine, could include cocaine, could include any sort of strongly reinforcing substance. And you sort of turn the rat loose in the cage, and then by accident, at some point, they're running around crazy. They hit the lever, and then they learn, oh, that feels pretty good, because the lever makes the syringe give them an injection. And then they learn that association. Oh, if I hit that little thing over there, that I'll get something, a good feeling. So then they do it again, and then they do it again. And they learn that association, and it's stored in memory as an expectancy. So they learn that over time, that if they hit this lever, they will get a reward. Similarly, if it's an aversive, if they do a particular behavior, it will be unpleasant, and so they won't do that behavior. Now, what happens is, over time, that behavior leads to certain patterns that sort of reinforce that behavior. And what I'm suggesting, and I'm going to suggest in this talk, is that if we were to sort of cut the, turn off the juice, if you will, turn off this connection between the Skinner, the lever and the syringe, that over time, what the rat would learn is, I hit the lever and nothing happens. Oh, well, it used to happen. I'll try it again. Oh, nothing happened. I'll try it again. Nothing happened. Over time, they learn that this association is no longer relevant. are no longer salient. And so eventually the behavior becomes extinguished. And in essence, that's what our medications do. What it does is most of the medications act by blocking the reward, and in doing so, extinguishing the behavior. Over time, if you're exposed to reinforcing substances, they affect the primitive parts of the brain that determine reward and motivation, conditioned learning, memory and emotion, automated type activities, and eventually executive functioning and decision making. I mean, you make decisions around things that are going to be rewarding to increase them, and you make decisions to try to avoid things that are discomforting. And what the evidence suggests over many decades is that these changes are very long lasting. And what I'm hoping you'll see is that these changes in the brain really explain the behavioral manifestations that we see of the disorder. And I like the formulation that the 4 C's, which I'll talk about in a second. But so this is sort of from a perspective of behaviorism and what's called operant conditioning. You may remember this from your psychology course that you took. There's also an element of classical conditioning that goes on within the addictions. Classical conditions is sort of the story about Pavlov's dog, when he would put food in front of them and they would salivate, then he'd ring a bell, and eventually he no longer needed to put the food in front of them. He would just ring the bell and they would salivate. And in essence, that's sort of what triggers environmental and other factors that cause people to have craving for the substance, particularly if there are environments or what 12-step people call the people, places, and things. Those tend to cause sort of recurrence of the behavior because it's a conditioned memory. This cartoon I thought was sort of cute. It said, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." So, but just to remind us that there are multiple paradigms that sort of go into the development of this family of disorders. And these changes to the brain really are quasi-permanent. What we have here are what are called PET scans. The way PET scans work is it's basically a sugar that's metabolized by the brain, and you radiolabel it. You put some radioactive piece on it, a moiety on it, and if the sugar goes into the brain, it means the brain is the parts are metabolically active, and if not, if it's not there, then they're less active. And so things that are in red or yellow in this photo, normal activities of the brain, show up in yellow and red, and reduced activities are seen in the lower after 10 days of abstinence and after 100 days of abstinence. And this is for activities around centers that are associated with pleasure. So people tend to be quite unhappy and dysphoric and depressed during periods. We lose, what I like to think is we lose our hedonic tone. The levels of dopamine go down in the brain. And a lot of times that sort of bad feeling that we have is what leads to recurrent use, because you want to start to feel normal. These folks are not feeling normal. They're feeling quite bad. And often that leads them to go back to using. And as you can see, it can go on for quite a very long time. The other thing that is really salient, and by the way, and this is seen in really all substances that are reinforcing. The thing that's really particularly salient for opioids is that there is a withdrawal syndrome, and quite a severe withdrawal syndrome. For those of you who've never seen it, it's quite a powerful negative reinforcer. So when the person tries to stop using, they experience these excruciating symptoms: sweats, aches, diarrhea, shaking, feeling depressed, weakness, muscle spasm. Well, I've heard it described as, if you can imagine, like the worst flu, upper respiratory flu that you've ever had, and the worst sort of GI bug that you've ever had, and you sort of put them both together, that's sort of what the experience is like. It's quite miserable. And it's a very powerful negative reinforcer. So if you think of a negative reinforcer like you think of this particular Skinner box. So this is a Skinner box in which there's an electrified grid underneath the feet of the rat. And what happens is you can envision a scenario in which you turn the grid on, so it's electrified, and you drop the rat in, and they're sort of doing the hot foot dance. It's very unpleasant. It doesn't even have to be a very strong shock, but it could be, very unpleasant. And then they're running around like crazy because it's so terrible. And then they hit the lever, and the lever makes the shocks go away. Then, of course, the shocks come back, and then they learn over time, oh, if I keep hitting the lever, this really unpleasant feeling will go away. And evidence suggests that negative reinforcers, so it's sort of, again, that's different from punishment, right? Punishment is if you do the behavior, or do a particular behavior, you'll get an aversive. This is if you do the behavior, the aversive is taken away. And this is a very powerful reinforcer of behavior. And for many of our patients, really is the thing that drives them back to using. And this is what happens in all of our abstinence-based therapies. And often the withdrawal, can be quite protracted, and we can have folks who are really struggling for quite some time. The thing to bear in mind is that, dependence and addiction are not the same thing. And as I mentioned, the 4 C's are really according to American Society of Addiction Medicine, really, I find to really be the most useful paradigm for thinking about this. So they are: the compulsive use is the first C, impaired control, continued use despite consequences, and craving. So all of those behave. So you can see there's nothing in there about withdrawal. There's nothing in there about tolerance, which when you look at the DSM criteria, those tolerance and withdrawal are in the DSM criteria, but they're not here. And that's why I find these most useful, because you see this with all drugs of abuse and drugs of misuse. And the suggestion is that those neurobehavioral changes really explain the things that you're seeing when you see somebody in the throes of the 4 C's. People often confuse addiction with physiologic dependence. So people who have physiologic dependence will have withdrawal. And people who use a med appropriately, particularly an opiate appropriately, will develop tolerance and withdrawal. And those are the 2 aspects that I really want you to understand. So tolerance, what happens is over time, if there's chronic exposure of the mu-opioid receptors to opioids, over time they will downregulate. And what that means is that over time, if you use the same milligrams, the same dose of opioid, you will get less effect on the receptor, so less activation of the receptor. And the flip side of that is, in order to get the same amount of effect, you need an increasing dose. You either need an increasing dose, or you need a more bioavailable form to get to the receptor. And often this is why people go from snorting, which is a little bit of it, it's not as available as smoking, which is not as available as injecting. And basically what they're doing is they're upping their dose. So that's why over time, the natural history of somebody who's a user is, they will start often with oral, or they'll start, sniffing pills, and then they will move on to more bioavailable forms, routes of administration in order to get that higher dose that they need as they develop tolerance. So when I'm doing an assessment of somebody, if somebody tells me they're an injector, I can just check off the tolerance box because I know that that's the reason that they're doing it, for example. The flip side of it, though, is if you detoxify somebody, you take them off all their med, and this is often what happens in when you withdraw people, is they lose their tolerance. And if the flip side, it's the opposite of what we just spoke about. They get an increased effect at the higher, remember they've gone to this higher dose. If they use that same higher dose, they're going to overdose because their receptors now are going to be more sensitive because you have withdrawn them. And the flip side of it is, in order to achieve the same effect, they really need a lower dose. The other thing I want to emphasize is sort of the features of reinforcers or aversives. And so the thing that you're using for a reward or for punishment has to be salient. So it has to be meaningful to the person or to the mammal or the animal. So we always joke about lashes with a wet noodle or some sort of slap on the hand is not going to be that salient to a person, whereas electric shocks or withdrawal is actually very salient in most cases. Reinforcers and aversives, in order to make that association with the behavior, they should be immediate. So if somebody does a behavior and then they get the reward 6 months later, again, it's unlikely that they're going to make that association between the behavior and the word. But if it comes right away, then that association is made. And in criminal justice, we also talk about this in terms of sanctioning. Swift sanctioning sort of uses this principle. Similarly, it should be reliable. It should be certain. So when you do the behavior, you should, at a certain schedule, know that you're going to get the reward. The more often the reward comes, the more likely the behavior is going to be repeated. Of course, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be every time. Slot machines work on the principle that, like every 1 in 7, somebody's going to hit the jackpot, and that's enough to reinforce the behavior of putting your coins in there. If they gave a jackpot every time you pulled it, of course, the casino would lose money. So they do it just enough so that you're reinforced to put money in the slot machine, but not so much that they're going to lose money. And that's sort of how variable reinforcement works. And as we spoke, if the reinforcer loses its salience, immediacy, or reliability, those properties are lost, then the behavior over time will be extinguished. So in this circumstance with this rat, if we cut this cord and he keeps hitting the lever and he's no longer getting the reward, over time the behavior will be reduced and will eventually cease. So I want to acknowledge Liz Katz, who sort of shared this notion with Dr. Taxman and me back in the old CJ DATS days, that the notion that the issue that we have in criminal justice is that the positive consequences of drug use and crime tend to be very powerful reinforcers. They're salient, they're immediate, so you get euphoria or money right away. They're reliable, they happen every time. But the negative consequences, or the aversives, tend to be delayed. So, you're not arrested every time you commit a crime or use drugs. The notion of prison, HIV, all these other things, that negative things that can happen to people are delayed. and they're unreliable. I mean, that doesn't happen every time you use or every time you commit a crime. And so what you've done is you've set up a situation in which the reinforcement really favors the ongoing antisocial activity. The flip side of it is the opposite for recovery and rehabilitation. If somebody decides that they want to sort of turn their life around, the positive consequences, things like getting a job or housing or getting relationships back, are delayed and unreliable. It doesn't always happen. There are no guarantees in life that, even if you get back on the straight and narrow, that those good things are going to happen, those natural reinforcers that, we all depend on. But we do know that the negative consequences are going to be immediate and reliable, so there'll be withdrawal and craving, there'll be stress, there'll be dysphoria if you're going to be getting away from drug using friends, losing your social supports. So it really is challenging for folks to sort of make those changes. And I sort of put this out there for us to really understand, behavior change is hard. And I'm sure some of you have tried to diet, gosh knows I have, or tried to make a change in your lifestyle. It's very difficult. And the reinforcers in everyday life make it such that it's really challenging. So what I want to get to in the next section is to talk about how medication for opioid use disorder works by attenuating the positive and negative reinforcement. So what does it feel like when you have opioid use disorder? And this is a slide from the original work by Dole and Neiswander that established methadone as the treatment of choice for this disorder. And what it shows is, if you look at the white arrows at the bottom, on the y-axis are the functional states that people are experiencing. So somebody who is actively using short-acting opiates, an example would be heroin or fentanyl, is they sort of exist in three states. They're either high, feeling euphoria, they're sick, so we talked about what sickness feels like, or they're straight. They're feeling normal, like you and I presumably feel at the moment, though some of you are probably nodding off. But anyway, so what happens is they wake up in the morning, they're feeling dope sick in the morning. That's in the lower left here. And then they use, and then they feel high, and then they start to come down and feel normal, and then they know, uh-oh, I'm going to get sick soon, so I better go get another fix, and then so they go out and use again. And so they're spending most of their time either high or sick. They're spending very little time feeling normal, and that's sort of the nature of how short-acting opioids work. Over time, and that's what this dotted line is here in the middle, they develop tolerance, and so many of them are no longer getting high. They're just sort of using in order to keep from getting sick. And so that's sort of what's happening here on the right. Often that's when they seek treatment, they realize, oh, this is not working anymore. It's not fun anymore. And so they will seek treatment. What MOUD does in terms of its effect on the opioid receptor is, when we talk about a full agonist, something like methadone, it fully binds the receptors. So you get full receptor activity and activates it. So people get the feeling of being sick goes away. So we get rid of that negative reinforcement of using, but we have all the receptors bound, and so if they use on top of it, the amount of extra mu receptor activity that they'll get, which is sort of the marker for how much euphoria they'll feel, will be quite limited because they've pretty much reached the peak of what their receptors can do. This also maintains their tolerance. When we look at a partial agonist, an example of this is how buprenorphine works, and that's the active ingredient in Suboxone and Sublocade, is it binds the receptor very tightly, but activates only to a ceiling. So you don't get full activity here. You only get, so in this example, about 40% activity. But there's enough agonist activity that the behavior of taking the med is reinforced. So that's why folks are willing to take the bup under the tongue each day, because it is reinforcing to do that. There's a little bit of reinforcing. It's not as reinforcing as a full agonist, but it's still reinforcing to do that. And the thing about it is it binds the receptor really tightly, so you don't get any additional effect on top of it. So if somebody uses on top of the partial agonist, the receptor is bound with the buprenorphine, so they don't get any effect on top of it. I'll show you a nice example of that in a second. And then finally, there's the antagonist. That's how naltrexone works. That's what Vivitrol is, or oral naltrexone. And what it does is it binds the receptor, but doesn't activate it. So there's no activity in the mu receptor. So there's nothing reinforcing the activity of taking the med. It doesn't relieve the withdrawal or the feeling bad at all, but all it does is bind the receptor. You can't get high because the receptor is really tightly bound once it's there. But there's really nothing driving you to take the med. It really doesn't make you feel any better. It doesn't make you feel necessarily normal right away. And this is largely why the oral medication, oral naltrexone, has been shown to not be effective with opiate use disorder, and why the injectable was developed. So what medication does is it decreases the reinforcement by making the reward less immediate and less reliable, and stopping the negative reinforcement associated with withdrawal. And so what happens is eventually it will extinguish the expectancy that using will get you high, and the condition responses associated with it. What this figure shows is people who are pre-medicated with buprenorphine. These are similar PET scans to what I showed before. Except they're using a marked opioid in this circumstance. So they're pre-medicating the people with buprenorphine at this first line of 0 milligrams, 2 milligrams, 16 milligrams, and 32 milligrams. So they're pre-medicating them with that, and then they're giving them this radio-labeled morphine analog on top of it. And if the analog gets into the brain, it means that the morphine is binding at the receptor. And so, these are the brain. This is the brain, a sideways view of the brain. And then this is what we call an axial view, which is if I took a chainsaw and cut my skull off the top, that's sort of, you would be looking down on the top of my head. That's what it would be looking like. That's what these figures are. And so when they have no buprenorphine on board and you give them this radio labeled thing, all these areas light up. Remember the red and the yellow? So here is the reward center here in the middle of the brain. So this means they're getting high, right? Because there's no bup on board. But as you pre-medicate them with higher and higher levels of bup, before you give the med, you see there's no longer red or yellow. So it's completely blocked them from going into the brain. They're not going into the brain, you're not getting high, you're not getting the euphoria. And that's how it works. So how does it feel to be on MOUD, particularly the agonist therapies we're talking about? So somebody is taking methadone here in the morning, an oral dose, or buprenorphine. They feel the amount of functional state tone that they have is they feel normal. It's very long acting. And so you see over time, so they're not spending a lot of time being high or being sick. They're feeling normal. And that's how it works. They have blockade. They're reinforced to take the med enough, but they're not getting high. They're just feeling normal, presumably like you and me. There are three forms of medication, or three compounds that have been approved: methadone, which is a full agonist. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist, and naltrexone. The dosing differs, and the thing about to note is that there's now injectable forms available for buprenorphine and for naltrexone. They've all they all have various advantages and disadvantages. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them just for time's sake. Is that, and some of these I've already mentioned. Methadone is very highly regulated, given in highly structured supervised settings. And there's a lot of stigma associated with it, unfortunately. And early on in treatment, there is a requirement for in-person dosing, and there are a lot of drug-drug interactions and things that you need a skilled practitioner who's going to be doing that, and that's sort of why it's done in a highly structured program. Buprenorphine is much safer than a full agonist, largely because of that ceiling. Remember, we showed its effect sort of levels off, and so there's also a ceiling for the respiratory depression and other things you see with higher doses of opioids. It is so it's available in office settings. It has to be. It either can be taken on a daily basis, and that's how most of our patients are taking it. Although increasingly we're seeing folks who are getting the injectable. And then there's naltrexone, and as I mentioned, naltrexone is not reinforcing, so it has no addictive potential. But folks need to be completely opioid free when they take it, because if you give somebody who is on heroin, which is a full agonist, and they're in this state here, and you give them either a partial agonist or an antagonist, the amount of mu activity goes down quite precipitously, and you develop precipitated withdrawal. And that's sort of why folks why the induction onto buprenorphine and onto naltrexone is a little bit involved as compared to methadone. In many respects, methadone in correctional settings, what we're starting to see in Massachusetts is there are a number of patients who prefer it in correctional settings because you don't have to go into a withdrawal state. You can just start somebody on it right away. There are decades of studies on methadone that show it improves retention and decrease opioid use and mortality and crime and HIV seroconversion. I mean, one of the best studied medications in all of medicine's armamentarium, but underutilized relative to the extent of the problem, and highly, highly regulated. To give you a sense of how effective methadone is, I just want to share with you one of my favorite studies from Sweden. This was a study by Gunn and Grudenbach. They took 34 heroin-dependent patients who applied for entry to the only methadone clinic in a Swedish town, and they randomly assigned them to methadone and non-methadone treatment. The non-methadone group, got sort of state-of-the-art detoxification and intensive outpatient treatment. And then they followed them up for 2 years to see what happened. And 2 years later, 12 of the 17 in the methadone group were no longer using drugs. 10 were employed, 2 were in school. Those in purple here had been expelled from treatment. And there were there was 1 in prison and 3 who were continuing to use. But the vast majority of folks were doing well, and interestingly, there were no deaths. However, in the non-methadone arm here on the right, there was only 1 that was doing well. That's this person up here. 2 were dead, and 2 were, here are the 2 they're dead down here. 2 were in prison, and the rest had recurred with their heroin use, and a number had severe medical complications, sepsis, endocarditis, and amputation. So 71% after 2 years, 71% of the methadone group were doing well compared with only 6% of the controls. So at this point they decided, oh, you know what, this trial is no longer ethical. We're going to offer the methadone to everybody in the non-methadone group, and we're going to continue to follow them out to 5 years. And what they did at 5 years, of the 13 of the methadone group were still not using heroin. 9 of the controls had applied for and entered the methadone program. 8 of them were drug-free and socially productive. Of the 8 controls who did not apply for methadone, 5 were dead, allegedly from overdose. 2 were in prison, and this one person here was doing well. You know, and our entire drug policy in this country has been around finding this one guy. That's been by these were all men, so I say guy, but they were guys. But the fact of the matter is, you know, we ignore these deaths. We ignore all these people over here who are doing well. And, you know, there's really just incredibly strong and compelling evidence that this is an effective treatment. But for many, many complicated reasons which we can talk about, it's really been underutilized. Similarly for buprenorphine, it's highly effective. Some strong data, similar data showing that it's reducing overdose death rates, very low risk for overdose on methadone, and a very decreased risk of misuse, and again, available in ambulatory settings. Buprenorphine, you know, a lot of us had a lot of hopes for the injectable naltrexone. Naltrexone. I was engaged in one of the early American studies of this, and you know, it has a lot of issues. The problem with it is there's no withdrawal when you stop it. And there's no incentive to, you know, having to get the shot is itself aversive, right? So what we've seen, and there's some data from Massachusetts showing this, is that people typically, after 1 or 2 shots, tend to stop. As a matter of fact, in the data in Massachusetts, the median number of shots that folks got from depot naltrexone was 1. And there is some concern, since it causes people to lose their tolerance. There's a lot of concern about overdose after folks stop. When we look at what actually works, these are data from my colleague Robin Clark at UMass. You know, there's in terms of relapses per 100 months of treatment, these are from Medicaid data. Folks who are on the agonist treatments do extremely, extremely well. And we're starting to see this in corrections, and I just want to give you a teaser for some data that we have from a natural experiment looking at 2 counties here in Massachusetts, Franklin County and Hampshire County. Franklin County started providing buprenorphine in 2015, and Hampshire County didn't really start until 2019. So we had a period from 2015 to 18 in which we had a natural experiment. Folks in Franklin County who went into the Franklin County Correctional Facility could receive buprenorphine, and not in Hampshire, fairly similar populations. And so we wanted to look at, following these folks up, what happened to them. And at baseline, the populations were fairly similar. That's what's in the yellow here in terms of demographics. Again, it's primarily white men, given these were small rural counties, small counties out in western Massachusetts. But you can see, you know, in terms of what meds they received. So in the Franklin County arm, 86% received buprenorphine, 7% received injectable naltrexone, and there was only 1 person who received naltrexone in the Hampshire group. And what we saw over a year follow-up for these folks is, in terms of any recidivism, a very strong signal for a 40% reduction in recidivism. We define recidivism as any arraignment, incarceration, or parole violation. And this was primarily driven in the data here by arraignments and incarceration. It's not because of a difference in sort of parole, the way these two counties manage technical violations of parole. And I think the part that's really compelling is when you look at the charges that folks received, the biggest differences were seen in property crime and in drug-related crimes, and not in violent crimes. So some early data suggesting that it really does have an impact on recidivism. We already know that it impacts mortality. We're still trying to get all of the death data for these folks. There may be some signal in terms of mortality, even though it's a relatively small study. So really opportunities in to affect recidivism, but also overdose deaths. I just want to sort of walk you quickly through my thinking about tolerance. You know, when you detoxify people, either by taking them off their opioids or withdrawing them and having an abstinence focus, they lose their tolerance. We're in a setting where illicit opioids now are more widely distributed, lower price, and in a much more unstable, erratic market in terms of what's available. If you have poor access to medication as an alternative, a lot of these folks turn to street sources. And because of the high potency and variability in the fentanyl, what we're seeing is high rates of overdose and death. This is what's gone on since 2010 and into the current time. And really, in my estimation, the answer is that, or one answer is that we need to do more to increase access to MOUD. There's a lot of community data to suggest similar effects, that it really prescribing and longer years of opiate therapy saves lives. These are data from our colleagues in Baltimore showing that they were one of the few areas over the 2000s that showed decreases in overdose deaths at a time where the rest of the country was seeing dramatic increases. And it was largely driven by huge efforts that they made to increase access to buprenorphine in their community. There are some older data, again, suggesting that buprenorphine has a huge effect, sort of similar to what we saw with the methadone study in terms of preventing deaths. This was a very small study, 20 patients in each arm. Controls got a 6-day taper, and the buprenorphine maintained group had no deaths, and there were 4 deaths, 20% in the detox group. And you know, this is a very tiny little project. I'm the chief research officer of my institution, and when I see this, what this suggests to me is it's a small sample, so the effect size must be huge. This is not sort of, you know, we're getting a 3% improvement. These are huge differences, and really an opportunity to save lives. Finally, to sort of talk, I was asked to talk a little bit about the 3 medications and who's likely to benefit. You know, folks who have a preference for agonists are at risk for overdose. I mean, the data for methadone in terms of reducing overdose is the strongest. Our patients who benefit from the structure of supervised dosing and mandated counseling, who want to have all their services in one location, of complex comorbidity, unstable situations, and wouldn't be unable to ensure the security of buprenorphine, although the injectable buprenorphine has resolved some of those issues. People with co-occurring pain that doesn't respond well, or if you're unable to stabilize them on bup. You know, folks with buprenorphine typically are those who prefer to receive their treatment in an office setting. Again, it's folks who believe at risk for overdose, who want flexible scheduling, particularly folks who are working, and you know, have other comorbidities that are able to be managed in an office setting with periodic visits. and they're stable enough to be able to manage the medication. And then those that don't have high amounts of pain that will require use of opioids. Naltrexone at this point is really about preference. Those who clearly do not want agonist therapy but want protection against, during the period where people are the 28 days that they have the naltrexone on board, they are protected from overdose. There is some evidence for that. It's the period when they stop using it that is risky. So as long as they are motivated and want to do it, have a high degree of motivation, and are committed to engage in treatment and will adhere to the injection, those folks would be good candidates, those with good therapeutic alliance, if they have job stipulations that forbid the use of agonists, if they're unable to access it. But they have to be able to detox. They have to be able to come off all meds for a week. A lot of our patients find that to be very challenging. They also have to be able to tolerate the oral naltrexone for a brief period before they get their first injection. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions. I hope that you appreciate. We still have a major overdose crisis. We have effective tools to reduce overdose, and I hope we will continue the momentum in terms of making them accessible to our patients and clients. Thank you.